My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. Thanks for joining our Security Outcome Deep Dive webinar series. In this series, we will examine in more detail each outcome in our Identity Defined Security Outcome Library. Members of our technical working group team who develop the outcomes will join me to discuss the goals of the outcome and the various implementation approaches. My guest today is Ben Goodman from ForgeRock. Ben, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much for having me. So I am the Senior Vice President of Global Corporate and Business Development here at ForgeRock. So my responsibilities include our M&A strategy as well as our technology ecosystem, so all of our technology partners, which, you know, the IDSA kind of falls into because it's all these great partnerships that you've brought into the working group. And then I also am a member of our CEO staff, so I work with our leadership team on the overall corporate strategy for ForgeRock. And, you know, prior to my time at ForgeRock, I spent time at VMware in our end user computing business. And then prior to that, I spent a long time at Novell with their identity business as well.
Terrific, and it's great to have you here today. Let me share a little bit about the IDSA before we dive into today's security outcome focused on revoking access based on a high-risk event. Just a quick note, if you're already familiar with the IDSA or have listened to another webinar in this series, you can skip ahead for about 6 minutes to get to the meat of the discussion. The IDSA exists to help organizations with the key challenges they're facing today. It's no secret that cybersecurity has become cumulatively challenging. Stumble on that word always. Threats and vulnerabilities are a moving target. New technologies and defense mechanisms are introduced daily. And now with COVID-19, our traditional work environment has been turned upside down. Most organizations have been collecting identity and security tools over many years, solving the threat of the day, the week, the year. A single tool, single vendor approach is not working, as witnessed by the last challenge here. Number of identities organizations manage and secure has exploded in the last 5 years, and the risks associated with those identities has as well. In our latest research, called Identity Security, a Work in Progress, we found that 79% of organizations have suffered an identity-related breach in the last year, which leads us to the need for a new approach to security. Identity has moved beyond an operational function and should now be considered a critical cybersecurity technology. It's important to recognize that every business transaction, attack service, or target involves a credential and a service or piece of data. We can no longer sustain a one problem, one tool approach. Cybersecurity technologies must fundamentally work together if they are to achieve meaningful effectiveness. And lastly, we must operate with the mindset that the cumulative investment must make the whole more effective. We must share the intelligence, the identity context, across the entire enterprise technology stack. Most people think that identity is really hard, but the good news is that identity technologies have come a long way in the last 5 years, and they are becoming easier to deploy and maintain. The identity and access management technology segments are working better together, and integration between identity technologies has improved as well. Our goal is to help bridge what we see as the gap to security, not just the integration of identity with security technologies to improve your total security spend, but to make you more secure through identity. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through a number of activities: cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership through blogs, webinars, and speaking, identity-centric security framework, which is what we'll highlight today, customer implementation stories, learning from your peers and others that have gone before you, and lastly, creating a virtual community for sharing experiences and validation. The primary work product of our technical working group, which I mentioned earlier, is the Identity-Defined Security Framework, which consists of security outcomes, implementation approaches, and best practices. We make recommendations around best practices and security outcomes. However, we provide multiple alternatives to achieve the desired outcome through implementation approaches, and only you and perhaps your vendors can determine what approach is best for you. This is the full library of security outcomes that have been published to date. The goal is to expand this library as a free community resource. The technical working group team will be adding to the library, but we also want to enlist the expertise of those living and working in the trenches and implementing identity security outcomes to add to it as well. And I'll tell you how you can get involved at the end. So as I mentioned, today we're going to dig into accesses revoked upon detection of a high-risk event associated with that identity. So with that, Ben, let's have you come back in, and let's talk about revoking user access based on a high-risk event. What is it, and why is it important?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and by the way, once again, thank you for having me. So many times we look at authentication and identity as like a one-time thing. So the user authenticates and they're done. But as we've become much more sophisticated, we're recognizing that there's many more opportunities for us to look at user behavior, user activity, and utilize that to adjust authentication and to try to reduce risk. And so, we want to use the tools that are available to us in order to really reduce risk. And that's what I think why this is so important, because we have these new sets of tools, these new capabilities that can make our system much smarter. And we can also do it while still having a really great user journey, which is key.
Right, so it's that balance between security and user experience that we hear so much about. There's nothing worse than having someone bypass security because, it adds 2 or 3 seconds to their access to an application, right?
Well, and what's happened also in the past is that we, when we only evaluated authentication, we kind of overloaded the authentication step with all of the security because there was no security. Once you got past the username and password, you were free to do whatever you were free to do. And so by adding in this additional intelligence, now we don't have to overload our initial authentication as much, and that can provide a much better user experience.
So we talk about, a high-risk event associated with that identity. In our current environment, I'm sure that there's lots of risky events, but how would you define a high-risk event? And what would be your guidance to organizations in terms of automatically revoking access? I've heard stories about a CEO being in an unusual place and having their access revoked. And obviously, if you take away access of your CEO, you're not necessarily going to be in their favor. So, what would be your guidance around defining a high-risk event and how you apply that to this scenario?
Yeah, taking away a CEO's access when he or she needs it is a career-limiting move for sure.
Right.
And so I think a couple things. So, generally speaking, in terms of the way the security outcomes defines a high-risk event, we're really looking for things that are outside of policy. So whether the tool you're using is a UEBA tool that's looking at user behavior, whether it's a security information event management or a SIEM tool that's looking at network behavior or access behavior, things that are really out of norm, things that are out of policy are high risk. And quite frankly, every organization may be a little different in their ability to tolerate risk and what they consider risk. So generally speaking, what we're talking about with security outcomes is primarily things that are outside of policy and that ideally are detected by some type of real-time tool that is watching this behavior. Because what you don't want is you don't want to detect this behavior, after the fact. You don't want to close the door after the barn door after the horses have already left, right? And so that's why integration with something like a UEBA tool or a SIEM tool is really essential here for detecting these high-risk events.
So it's an interesting thing, right? So the user, behavior is set on, history up until this point. Well, as we all know, at the end of March, early April, I think probably user behavior changed significantly. So how does that affect this particular scenario, and what can organizations do to address that change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, behavior is changing, and so most of these smarter tools are going to adjust for it over time. My guess is a lot of people had some immediate false positives as a result of the change in user behavior, and hopefully these systems have now had time to kind of readjust. I think another thing that's really important when we talk about behavioral analytics is, you can't just turn things over to the machines and let them do their job. In some cases, you want to integrate with something like an IGA tool or an ITSM tool, and I know we'll talk about that brings in some users, some human interaction into the process to kind of, be a vetting agent, if you will. The other thing is that, one of the things that behavioral analytics can tell us is they can also tell us if something looks like a human or a bot. And so that's also important. So even though someone's behavior may have changed because they went from working in the office to working at home, they're still work like a human and still act like a human. So, a lot of modern tools, whether they be behavioral biometrics tools or behavioral analytics tools, can also look at behavior and just see when it doesn't look like normal human behavior. And that's important as well.
Interesting, yeah. So we did a survey recently, as I alluded to earlier. In that survey, we asked a question about the frameworks, whether it's regulatory or other common security frameworks, and how often they are being used by organizations. And we found that a little less than 50% are using some of the common frameworks that are out there. And one of the things that we want to do as an organization is recognize that people are using frameworks, and then we're coming at it saying, these are identity-centric security approaches, and we want to make sure those two things align so that organizations can follow sort of both approaches, if you will. Talk a little bit about the security frameworks that this particular outcome aligns with.
Yeah, so, in the slide here, we talk about both Zero Trust and CARTA. Zero Trust has the unique capability to be both a framework and a buzzword at the same time. So you want to be careful about using an overloaded term. But the reality is that's really what we're talking about here, right? This capability to detect these high-risk events and react to them in real time is what Zero Trust is. It's also CARTA, which is, like I said, I wasn't sure which A is which, but it's either continuous access, real-time authorization, or continuous authorization, real-time access, which is, Gartner's framework that kind of aligns very similarly to Zero Trust. And so what we're really talking about here is, it's cliched to say, but identity becoming the new perimeter. And what we're talking about here is being able to authenticate a user both initially and continuously as they go and access different applications and services. And so what's important here is this detection of a high-risk event it fits so nicely in with that framework, because when you detect a high-risk event, if you're forcing users to continuously authorize to all the applications or services that they're accessing, you can really change their access in real time. You can also do things like four-step-up authentication or additional authentications if need be.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about adoption. So one of the questions we asked in the survey related to security outcomes, and we kind of looked at it from two different perspectives, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the general question was, how far along are you in implementing these 8 outcomes? And in this case, I think 43% had indicated they had it fully implemented, and about a third said that it was somehow in progress. Is that surprising to you at all, or any thoughts about that adoption of the general population of the survey?
I would say, yeah. I think maybe people are very kind to saying that to their own implementation, saying it's fully deployed. I think maybe people have the capability to detect a specific high-risk event, but I'm doubtful that nearly half the people and nearly 3/4 of overall respondents have made progress on this. I mean, this just seems like something to me that SIEM tools aren't new, and UEBA tools aren't new, and integrating them with identity systems aren't necessarily new concepts either, but wide deployments that are really, taking advantage of the data that are available and reacting in real time. I'd be pretty surprised if 43% are fully deployed on that, and then and equally as surprised if nearly over 75% are have gotten even a partial deployment in place.
Yeah. So similar to social media, we live our best lives online.
Yeah, I think maybe, right?
Yeah. So in the survey, we asked a question about the sort of security culture, if you will, of the organization. So we kind of used it as a demographic question. Do you have a forward, or do you have a culture that focuses on identity security outcomes, right? Are you identity forward, if you will? And so we took a different slice of the data and said those folks that, do kind of self-identify as forward thinking around identity indicated they were farther along in implementing this. So, kind of maybe temper that response too. I guess the other interesting part about those forward thinking companies is that they indicated that they had 34% of them had reported an identity-related breach in the last 2 years, as opposed to sort of the general population, if you will, at 79%. So, any thoughts on that? I mean, certainly this idea that identity-forward companies are seeing less breaches is a positive sign.
Absolutely, and I was just, I was thinking about the last slide, and I think this speaks to a little bit to the sophistication of the people that interact with the IDSA, right? I think they are more identity sophisticated by nature. And so, I could see that based on that data sampling, that it would kind of over-rotate to customers that were a little bit forward-thinking when it comes to identity, and obviously as a result, forward-thinking when it comes to implementing the security outcomes. So, I think that makes sense that the people that are respondents to an IDSA survey are, probably trend better than the general population when it comes to these metrics. And so I think that's a great sign and a testament to the type of practitioners that IDSA interacts with.
Yeah. So just to be clear, the research was independent. So there was no bias there, but I think certainly those folks that kind of identify themselves as forward thinking around identity are seeing better results. I think for me that's kind of the takeaway, as
Sure.
Slightly biased as it might be. So let's move on then and talk about the implementation approaches. As I mentioned, we're not making recommendations about one approach over another, but we're just giving you options based on what your scenario is. So the first one is using IGA approach for remediation. So you want to talk through this one?
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit before, right? Which is when an event occurs in a runtime systems like a UEBA system or a SIEM system, kind of capturing that event, and then the action that you can kick off as a result of that event may be asking for some type of human interaction, most likely be a certification event. So actually asking a manager or an app owner to certify access or behavior. Or going as far as to automatically deprovision or disable an account. And so, it's a question of whether you're doing the G or the A function in IGA, right? So the G function is kind of the certification, get a human involved, have them approve or revoke. And the A function is really about, the administrative function where you can actually, reach out and touch the account or an identity and either disable it or delete it or something along those lines.
Right. Got it. So the next approach then is very similar, but it introduces access management into this scenario. So maybe talk a little bit about the differences between this approach versus leveraging IGA as sort of that critical component.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, IGA, we're really talking about an administrative type event, right? Where we're going to go and disable an account or delete an account, or move it to a different group or take away access, things that are, kind of administrative in nature. where access management tends to be much more runtime in nature, where you're actually going to block access right away. You're going to revoke a token. You're going to force the user to do a stronger form of authentication, some type of step-up authentication, force a user to re-authenticate. So first of all, typically this may affect the user directly as opposed to just, affecting something that goes around behind the scenes where you're actually prompting the user to do something in real time. But also it could affect their session state itself as opposed to just the account. And, these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? You may want to disable an account, but you may also want to make sure that the existing sessions that they have available are suspended. You may decide that you're going to have the user step up, and then only upon failure of step up are you going to reach out to IGA. And so, these two things aren't mutually exclusive. They often work together. Another thing that, as systems become more sophisticated, is the activity that occurs that the access management system is aware of, like a user authenticating, a user authorizing, a user federating. You can use that data to make both IGA and UEBA and SIEM systems smarter. And so it really does create kind of a virtuous cycle.
Great. And then the last one brings in an ITSM, IT Service Management tool, into the mix. And I think people don't typically think of, tying their access management or IGA systems or even UEBA and SIEM into ITSM, but maybe talk a little bit about that one and the role that plays in achieving this outcome. Yeah.
Yeah, so this plays right into the don't take away your CEO's access, at the end of the quarter use case, right? There may be certain situations where you feel comfortable with an automated decision. There may be certain situations where you're fine with a access certification that may take time, or you're fine with revoking a token or causing a user to do a step-up authentication. There may be other times where you actually want some type of approval flow. You may want to do that prior to kicking off any automated process, or having the user even know that you're aware of the high-risk behavior. And so bringing an ITSM tool into play gives you that kind of human-based workflow capability. Also, gives you interaction with those as well.
Great. So those are the three implementation approaches, Before we wrap up, any other sort of last minute or parting commentary around this particular outcome and the importance, especially now in the, with the distributed environment that's been forced upon us?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I think, there's just a lot of, we in a very short time have moved from a world where everything was owned by IT, right? Users came in, they sat down at a desk that was owned by IT, accessed a system that was owned by IT, across a network that was owned by IT, and we had all this control through ownership. For a while, we've been recognizing that the firewall wasn't an adequate protector of our sessions anymore, and so we started to move to more identity-centric ways of doing things anyway. But now that just got all accelerated, and I've seen analysis out there that we've seen 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months, and so that makes all of this even more important in my eyes, in my opinion. And so having this capability to understand behavior in real time, and then react to that behavior, and take a more secure posture, whether that be taking access away, whether that be asking the user to, introducing some additional friction that the user has to deal with, like a step-up authentication. Those are tools that we have in our tool belt today. And so as we've been forced to adjust to a changing world, we're very lucky that we're asked to do it at a time where there are tools that can address some of these higher risk concerns. And I think that's really exciting.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Ben. So just to move on a little bit, I mentioned, how do organizations become forward thinking? As I mentioned, the research showed that companies who indicated a forward-thinking approach to identity security had significantly fewer breaches. So I'm sure that question is on everybody's mind, is how do I get there? So we have suggested 5 steps to follow, and I'll just walk through these quickly. Discover all of your identity types. So make sure to include human employees, customers, third parties, and non-humans, application, service, and IoT when you're identifying your identity types. Identify the vulnerability and risk associated with each identity type. It's obviously, with the shift to a remote workforce, this may have changed. And also identify the risk associated with your corporate resources that are being accessed as well. Establish your current state against the identity-defined security outcomes that we recommend, and as I mentioned, there's 16 out on our website. Create a roadmap and work with your solution provider and vendors to determine capabilities and identify gaps. And implement using the desired approach. And lastly, the most important thing is measure your success. So Ben, I want to thank you for being here today. It was a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me again.
And before we sign off, I wanted to point you to a couple of additional resources that support the discussion today. So the research report I mentioned, Identity Security, a Work in Progress. And there's also several blogs that provide additional commentary around the results and the security outcomes. And then lastly, certainly we want to get your feedback, as I mentioned previously. So if you're interested in participating, check out the security outcomes, join our forum that you'll see under the community menu item on our website. And lastly, there's more deep dive series webinars will be added to our Bright Talk channel, so you should receive an email when new webinars are posted. Thanks for joining us today. We hope that you will join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. Thanks.